pleasure to be joined by none other than Gideon Rachman.
Hello.
He needs no introduction. He's the chief foreign policy commentator and columnist for the Financial Times, and I think he's very well known in India and the rest of the world as well. So it's a pleasure having you, Mr. Rachman.
Pleasure.
So here we are in Kyiv, and today is the third anniversary. What do you make of the situation?
It's bad. I mean, I think because basically the Ukrainians are very worried that America's going to withdraw support for them and pursue this deal with Russia. And although the Europeans provide a lot of military aid, there are some things that only the Americans can provide. Certain forms of weaponry, but also help with targeting of Russia, and also the satellites imagery that Elon Musk provides through Starlink, not satellites but internet basically. And without that, they'll be really fighting at a massive disadvantage to the Russians. So I'm sure they're determined to carry on, but they would be in difficulty.
I was just struck by the kind of remarks that were just made by the Ukrainian Prime Minister and before him earlier in the morning by former Prime Minister of UK, Boris Johnson. They sounded to me overtly optimistic about certain things. And I'm just wondering how much of that really reflects the situation on the ground, because I understand the morale has to be boosted at all times. But how does it really truly reflect the situation?
Boris Johnson is always over-optimistic about everything, so I wouldn't really take anything he says seriously. Everything's fine in his world. Also, he's in a very difficult political situation because he's kind of tied his fortunes to Trump, and Trump is in the business essentially of betraying Ukraine, and Johnson can't acknowledge that, I think maybe even to himself. And sure, the Ukrainian Prime Minister, what's he going to say? It's all over? No, he's not. And I'm sure that, I suppose they take heart from the fact that 3 years ago today, everyone thought they'd be conquered in a week, and they fought back, and, Russia has done terribly since then.
Yeah.
They've lost, I think a Western military officer said that Russia lost 400,000 people last year, killed or wounded, and took 0.5% of Ukrainian territory.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Ukraine has reason to believe that it can fight back from bad odds. They've done it before.
Yeah, I mean, and that actually brings me to this understanding, because the way the narratives are being shaped right now. I mean, today you know that it's completely hijacked by narratives. Okay.
Sure.
But somewhere then the real progress that Russia is making on the battleground remains painfully slow. So in many ways, Russia's style of war in Ukraine is probably a classic example of how not to fight a war.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, they I don't know whether they were prepared to take massive losses, but they have taken massive losses, and it's very kind of Second or First World War tactics. You just grind forward, rely on a weight of numbers, and complete indifference to how many of your own side you get killed. And that seems to be their tactic. But I fear that it may finally begin to work because the Ukrainians have been able to hold them off, partly because I think they're better motivated, but also because they've applied technology very skillfully, drone warfare, all of that. But it does require being able to see the battlefield. And if they can't do that in the future, that's a problem.
And what do you think is the agency of Europe here? Because I think that is the most, I would say, crushing blow to the transatlantic alliance today, which is that Europe is just nowhere on the table now.
Yeah, Europe actually has provided, whatever Trump says, as much financial aid as the United States and almost as much military aid. But as I say, there's certain capacities America provides that are difficult to replicate. But yeah, I think that is the other thing that's happening. I think you're seeing this week the breakdown of the transatlantic relationship, which has been there for 80 years and has provided Western Europeans, with a huge sense of security. And now I think if you look at what Chancellor Merz of Germany was saying after his election, he essentially said, we can't rely on the United States anymore. And so the question now is, can Europe in this situation really mobilize itself to do more to defend itself? There are two questions. Can they support Ukraine? But also, can they protect themselves? Because European leader after European leader says Putin's ambitions don't stop at Ukraine, that he would be prepared to attack a NATO country, attack the Baltic states, that he has designs on the rest of Europe. They seem to believe that. Question is, can they get their act together and stand up independent of the US, which they have become very dependent on?
And where do you think is the question of maybe it's the profit earned over the $300 billion frozen assets, from Russia. Do you think that would be spent on Ukraine, or the $300 billion themselves? I think it's a very complicated question unto itself, and that's why we don't really see the European, policymakers speaking about it. It's very popular in conferences and other
Yeah.
platforms, but I don't really see a European policymaker or decision maker speak about that.
No, but doesn't mean they're not talking about it in private, of course.
Okay.
I mean, I think that, as you say, it's a decision they've been loath to take because of the concerns about what it would do to confidence in the European financial system. So that if others, for example, Britain is trying to get the Chinese to do more financial business in Britain, would they take fright if they saw, well, if they became an adversary, their assets could be confiscated? That kind of question does weigh quite heavily. But I wouldn't be that surprised if the Europeans finally were spurred into taking action by the shock of what Trump is doing. They need to find a lot of money quickly. And they also need to do something demonstrative to show that, well, Trump may be giving up on Ukraine, but we're not.
Right.
And so I'm not saying they will do it, but I think they'll have a proper discussion of it now. I think it's really on the table.
And there's this lot of discussion, around the minerals deal that Donald Trump is trying to strike. Keith Kellogg, on his behalf, is trying to strike with Ukraine, and I believe twice he's made the attempts, and President Zelensky has not agreed. Where do you think is the sticking point out there?
Well, I mean, it's a very, very lopsided deal. I mean, essentially, they are wanting to take possession of half of Ukraine's mineral wealth in return for nothing, for no security guarantees.
Aren't most of the critical rare earths that Ukraine has concentrated in the occupied territories?
Yeah, I mean, so one sort of slightly comic theory is that the Ukrainians know these minerals are not as valuable as the Americans seem to think they are, partly because they're in Russian occupied territory, or they may be covered up by minefields. But they're playing hard to get, and in a way trying to convince the Americans that there is this very valuable thing out there, even if it's actually kind of hard to get at, and to get a security guarantee in return. I think that would be a nice story if it were true. I mean, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because partly if Zelensky appears to mortgage the future of his country in return for nothing, then he really will be unpopular. So he has a domestic political problem. And also I think that people who look at this deal say, well, what has America become? This is a kind of mafia tactic. It's a protection money without the protection. So it's very disturbing about the Americans would behave in this way.
Right. And finally, where do you see countries, the middle order countries like India and this? India has, for 3 years, not taken a stand, maintained neutrality, at least projected itself that it's committed to peace building whenever time is right. But I've seen that in the two recent initiatives, one was Prisoners of War Swap, which was initiated by UAE, and the other was the talks between the American and the Russian sides, which were facilitated by Saudi Arabia. So far, do you find it strange that India has not really, offered its neutrality?
No, I don't. I mean, it's funny. I write lots of articles about this, and I almost never mention India. I write about what China's doing, what the US is doing, Russia, etc. India's not a player. I mean, they've irritated a lot of people in Europe by their stance, but I think the Europeans understand that they need a good relationship with India for other reasons. The European Commission is, I think, going en masse to India to look for a trade deal and so on. So I think they kind of shrug and say, well, we agree to disagree on this one. My personal view is, I don't know, you know India better than me. A lot of Indians will feel vindicated if eventually this comes to a deal and say, well, look, the Europeans got themselves very worked up about this thing, but what did they expect? This was always how it was going to end. Maybe they'll have a point on that. I do think, though, that I think even India may discover that a super transactional, super amoral US president is not good for India either. You do have a big card to play in that everybody wants a good relationship with India because of the size of the market, because of the way it can balance China. So maybe India will be fine. But this idea that sort of Modi and Trump are necessarily going to get on marvelously. Trump is very volatile and extremely self-interested. So I think that this sort of trashing the rules-based order isn't just a concern for Europeans. It could be a problem for India as well.
Okay, I see. And finally, how do you see the world order getting affected, getting shaped by Trumpian tactics?
pretty terrible. I mean, I think that basically, if I'm right, you're seeing the end of the Western alliance, and you're seeing an American leader that in some ways feels more instinctive sympathy for dictators like Putin and Xi Jinping. I think that's the next thing to watch. Will he do a deal with Xi? I think he'd like to. That's really bad for those of us who believe in liberal democratic principles. I still think that ultimately those principles will prevail because they're closer to what people want. I don't think many people want to live in a dictatorship. And I also think that they work better. You know, it's not a coincidence that the richest countries in the world tend to be liberal democracies because once you have autocracies, you have corruption, you have breakdown of the rule of law. But it's a very bad moment for liberal democracy at the moment.
So he doesn't take this China, Russia, North Korea, Iran axis the way it's been touted by many scholars across the world as being the axis of destabilization. So Trump doesn't buy that argument.
You know, I haven't spoken to the man, but I'd be surprised. You know, I think the thing is that there are lots of people around him with all sorts of theories about that kind of thing. Trump is not a very theoretical guy. He's interested in money. He's interested in his own ego. You know, he thinks he can make a deal with anyone. So, and because his power is so absolute at the moment, you see people around him tying themselves in knots, you know, jettisoning every other thing that they've said in the past, including on Ukraine, so that they can please the boss.
That's right.
And so basically, whatever is in Trump's disordered mind is what we're going to get from the United States, at least for a little while.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for speaking to me and for the print, and I wish you a pleasant stay here in Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.